Good afternoon. I think we're going to get started.
Jocelyn?
Good afternoon. My name is Meg Satterthwaite, and I am very pleased and honored to welcome you to the first annual Robert L. Bernstein Institute for Human Rights Conference. I am the faculty director of the New Institute, and it's a great joy and honor to welcome Robert Bernstein today, Bob, and to thank him for his incredible vision and contributions to the human rights movement. This conference, which will be looking at the issue of how human rights can respond to inequality, starts this afternoon, and it will extend all the way through tomorrow with 3 substantive panels tomorrow. So we'd be really pleased if you'll be here tomorrow as well. And right now, it's really my honor to turn over the proceedings to Professor Jerry Cohen, who really needs almost no introduction in this context. He is very much the doyen of U.S.-Asia law, and he's the faculty director of the U.S.-Asia Law Institute here, which is one of the brother or sister institutes within the Bernstein Institute for Human Rights. So I'd like to turn it over. Thank you so much.
I'll be very brief because the film is 83 minutes and we want some time for discussion afterward. But I just want to say what a great occasion it is to start this Bernstein Institute and the program today and tomorrow. And we're starting with 2 related, very important subjects. One, Tibet, and what can China and Tibet do? And the other, the problem of discrimination. Discrimination against women, both in Tibet and in China proper or Beijing, and the problem of migrant workers. And we're so lucky to have Jocelyn Ford with us. It's her film. And I've known her since her NPR days in Beijing, and she's a great creative person, and we're thankful she's giving us her time. Jocelyn, say a word now, and then we'll get her involved in the discussion right after the film.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's a great honor to be introduced by Jerry, of course. I just wanted to say thank you all for coming. A little bit of background, I've been in China since 2001, and I've known Zanta, the protagonist in the film, for about 10 years now, and filmed her for about 3 years. So I hope that you'll enjoy the story, and you'll have plenty of questions after. Thank you.
Well, we've just seen a remarkable film. There are many things we can say about it, and we have 4 very interesting, relevant commentators. I think first we should hear from our creator. This was a wonderful performance. Why don't you come up, or you can sit there if you want, but I think it'd be better if you use the mic here, Jocelyn.
Well, thank you. And I'm actually more looking forward to the questions than to saying a lot. I just like to mention that in China, I'm very excited about the reaction in China so far. My first screening was at Xinhua News Agency, and I've shown it at about more than a dozen universities and other organizations, including the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, et cetera, et cetera. I could either show, if you're interested, I could show you a brief clip of what young Chinese people are saying about the film, if that would work. Okay. If I can get this. You want to?
Less than 2 minutes?
Yep.
When I was in middle schools, every time I pass a train station or subway station, which have sellers just like them, I feel annoying and go away. I don't buy things and you stop bothering me. At the time when I finished seeing this documentary, I think I need to truly think about myself. So I think I need to feel sorry to him about how I disrespectful.
西藏人到底是怎么想。但是反而是我觉得你这个影片里面其实是反而对我们很多汉人来说是第一次去坐在那里听藏族人是怎么样觉得。
Originally to try to help those people, the Tibetan migrants. And I was just asking my friends what we as normal people can do.
为什么一定要去汉人去治理它？实际上就是有一种就所谓的大汉族主义在里面。
As we are in one country now, and we need to coordinate, and we need to know each other.
In a long life, that's the first time I've ever heard anyone of Chinese descent, Han descent, suggest, why do we have to govern them? Even the most enlightened Chinese I've known have grown up with mother's milk to say, of course, Tibet is ours. This was an unusual student, was it, who said?
I think most people in the room know how fast China changes. I left last night, so I can't tell you what people are saying today, but but I've met, she's not the only one I've met who have said that. I've met young people who say, look, they're so different from us. We have nothing in common. I don't know why we bother. This is a 20-something-year-old guy. So she's not the only one. I haven't asked the question consistently, but I think my feeling is when I arrived in China in 2001, I could not have had any of these conversations. I could not have made the film. I could not have shown it, and I wouldn't have gotten these reactions. So China changes quickly, and I find an incredible, intense interest in my film and the discussion about what we do next. And I'd like to add just one more thing which has surprised me personally, is that a lot of the young people, I find a generational difference in the reaction. But a lot of the young people are saying, so who should solve the problem? Is this for the government to solve, or do I personally have some responsibility? What can I as an individual do? Which was also something I rarely heard even probably 5 years ago. So,
How about a word from our sponsor, Alex Gardner?
Yes, before I say anything, I should like to thank Alex. Without Alex and the S.D. Rubin Foundation, this film may not have existed. So, thank you so much.
Why did you get involved in this?
Yeah, why?
Well, that's a good question. I guess the Rubin Foundation, we are interested in films because we like to promote sort of knowledge and understanding of the Tibetan region, Himalayan region. So films have long been sort of a particular interest of ours. This film attracted me, and it's still, I appreciate this film because it complicates things. It's not the normal Tibetan film you would see. You know, it's no one talks about independence in this film. No one talks about the invasion, the Chinese takeover, the communist invasion. This is just about what people live like in this region, and no one particularly looks good. You know, no one looks awful. People are sort of individuals doing things, and I think that's really needed. I think it's needed in China, as Jocelyn. I mean, there's a huge ignorance of Tibet in China, and also there's I would say a huge ignorance of Tibet in the United States and in Europe. I came out of a graduate program where my advisor was one of the first to sort of complicate and question the sort of Tibet, the American romance of Tibet, in which Tibetans are sort of, you know, exceptional. Tibet was a pure land where, you know, the ideals of human civilization were alive and well until the evil Chinese came in and destroyed everything. And that's just not the case. And I think this notion of Tibetan exceptionalism, I think, hurts the cause. Tibetans deserve Tibetans suffer enormous discrimination and injustice inside of China, and they deserve governance because they're people, not because they're special people. They deserve justice and equality and human rights because they're people. So I like this film because it shows them. It shows one particular Tibetan. I mean, I think one is always wise to avoid generalizing a whole people on the basis of one family. But I think this is a pretty accurate description of certainly this region and what it's like to be a Tibetan in China. And so I'm very pleased with this film for that reason.
Sangmota, I take it you're a Tibetan.
Hello. Yes. My Tibetan name is Sangmo, actually. So when I came to America, sometimes Tibetans have only one name. And my name is kind of that. Then they divided into two pieces, Sangmota. So I rather be called Sangmo. Anyway, why I'm here today, I saw Jocelyn's movie, the film, in 2014, last year at MoMA. Before I saw her actual movie, and I was reading the, description of the movies, and her movie really stood up among them. Perhaps the reason that, first of all, I'm a Tibetan, and I grew up in Tibet. A lot of things reminded me of the things that happen, and it's happening in Tibet, and it happened in the past, but myself have seen it. And then it just touches on a personal level. So when I went to see her movie and MoMA, so I approached to Jocelyn. I really wanted to thank her for filming Azenta's story. Azenta's story, it's her story, but it's all Tibetans. Every angle, it's when it comes to discrimination and oppression and a lot of things. And with social issues, which have not many people, I don't think do know. So I think this is it's a really, really worth of the film. It's amazingly well done, and I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Robbie Barnett, I always regard him as my guru about all things Tibetan. I don't want you to think because you haven't been given your own mic that we don't want to hear from you.
I should be silent after that introduction. Can only go wrong. But I'm here to push back from the other risk, the risk of our excitement at seeing a film that, as Alex says, breaks the mold of what you call Tibetan exceptionalism. And we have lived through an age, actually, I think many decades. If you go back to the 1930s, I think even 1910s, you can find films made by early filmmakers in the West and actually in Asia too, which were the same story about how wonderful Tibet was and how exotic and how romantic it was. So this is a long tradition that we're doing well to have it broken here, by your work. But and it's important. But we have to remember that we face in any project the problem that you mentioned of generalization. We have to get back to this question of what are we actually seeing, and we're seeing quite complex things. First of all, we have these two main stories. One story which is about, I think we could say, discrimination between Chinese and Zanta when she goes to at least in that class that she's interacting with in the city. And maybe another story is about your role, Jocelyn's role, that very interesting thing you bring out so well about what can change when a foreigner is watching, when a foreigner is present. That's a very interesting story that you describe, that you bring that out. And then there's a third story about this violence, this threat inside the family, this masculine domination that is really very disturbing and very important to see. But I want to resist the temptation to generalize from that. I think in this, amongst us here, perhaps only Sangmo knows what can be said about Tibetans in general. And if there are some researchers who are starting to work on this, but it's very, very early days. I do know that there is a problem of domestic violence in Tibetan communities, as in all our own communities. But I think that it's safer and wiser to think of the abuse in the film, in the Tibetan family, as being singular, because we don't know more than that. Something that Jocelyn and I and others, we've talked about a lot while you were making the film. How far can you go? How far should you be able to go in saying this is a Tibetan phenomenon based on this information? And of course, it's very complicated. This family doesn't speak Tibetan. They're speaking Cham, I think.
No, they're speaking Rama Tibetan. It's actually, that's a bit of another story, but as many of you probably know, there's so many different dialects and languages in Tibetan, and hers has actually been categorized according to, there's still controversy about this. So she is speaking Tibetan, but very few people speak her dialect.
Yeah, it's not recognizably, it's not it's not mutually comprehensible to probably other Tibetans. But this is part of the complexity of this question. There's definitely Tibetan parts of their culture and lives, but we need to be very careful before we jump into saying this is the truth of Tibet, or the truth of Tibetans. That we don't know. Of course, it could turn out to be, which should be pretty terrible. And there are many other bad stories to be discovered. But that's the cautionary note I want to put in here.
How do we find out the truth of Tibetans? To what extent are Chinese of varying descriptions able to study what's going on? To what extent are foreigners now given access to learn what's happening? Is it very closed off? That's the impression we get from abroad, certainly in recent years. What's the actual situation, and what can we look forward to?
Well, we're in a tough period now because China is in a kind of retrenchment, a kind of pulling back from the West and pulling back from Western ideas. So that suggests we're going to be looking at a pretty closed period for a little while. But when we look at Tibet in particular, we have to distinguish between different parts of Tibet. We can't quite generalize. The western part of Tibet, the Chinese called Tibet, the old area ruled by the Dalai Lama's government that the Chinese took over in 51, you can't do any study there. Maybe it's said that 5 foreign researchers are allowed there currently, in the last few years. It's very difficult for anyone to do research there. But in the eastern areas where this film was made, there's a little bit more flexibility. Foreigners can visit those areas. They're not meant to do research usually, but we might find things.
I don't understand, Robbie. You said that 1551, was it?
In 1950, did I say 50?
Oh, 1950.
Yeah, with the 1950, the Chinese moved into the Tibet what is now the Tibet Autonomous Region. And now it is almost impossible for foreigners to get there. So 220,000 went last year as tourists, but all in tour groups, very heavily managed. But the eastern areas, the Chinese moved into there. It's a much more complicated story over previous decades. Foreigners can visit there without a special permit.
Just the other day, the Chinese government said the Dalai Lama should recognize that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity. And you're saying something about 1951?
Well, there's a difference between saying you own something and between taking it over and running it. Of course, if the Chinese claim is right, they don't claim to have been running it for all those centuries. They claim that they allowed it to run itself, except for certain occasions, but they've certainly been running it since 1950. But it's very interesting that you point out about this remark that the Dalai Lama has to now say that Tibet has been part of China for antiquity. The Chinese have never said that before. This is an entirely new demand from the Chinese side, made in a white paper released last week, I think Wednesday, that takes us back a long way in any hope of seeing a settlement. Before, the Chinese government said the Dalai Lama has to say that Tibet is part of China. This was Deng Xiaoping's requirement from 1979. Now they say he has to say it's part of China for what sounds like hundreds and hundreds of years, which is something he's never been formally asked to do before, and he has said he would be not willing to do.
He has talked about only wanting autonomy. But China, the PRC government, doesn't seem to believe that.
Yeah, it looks like the reason they are saying they don't believe it, he's been saying this for nearly 20 years now, that he doesn't want to to demand independence. He'll accept being part of China if he gets autonomy. It seems the reason the Chinese say they don't believe him is because they want him to say that Tibet was part of China in the past. And this is now the sticking point. And they're trying to maneuver him to get him to say that before they'll concede on anything else at all. And that sounds like a logjam. That sounds like a recipe for no progress at all.
We have other Tibetans in the audience, and I wanted to call on Miss Tsering Dolka. Miss Dolka, oh, there she is, good. Why don't you come here and take the mic?
Hello, everyone. My name is Tsering Dolkar, and I'm currently the Vice President of Tibetan Women's Association for New York and New Jersey. I have previously served as an executive back in India, in Bailakupi, which is the largest settlement in exile.
What can you tell us about your reaction to the film?
When I got invited for the screening here, which they had here in one of the campuses in NYU, a Chinese friend of mine invited me. And one of my main objectives was to see the film. I found it interesting, but also to be able to come and meet and interact with the Chinese audience. I saw the film, and I'm really glad that it's a different kind of film. Sort of like she disrupted the usual system and went the other way. The usual documentaries that you see, like Alex mentioned, are about the Tibetan movement, the Tibetan struggle, and the human rights issues and stuff like that. So hers is really interesting because it's about an ordinary Tibetan woman and her journey, not just in Beijing, but also the kind of struggle that she goes through at her home. And I found it very interesting because me being, having worked as an executive for Tibetan Women's Association in exile, we do have a lot of issues with gender discrimination within our community. That's something that's been a major part of my work, and something that as a chapter worked very closely with the Central Women's Association, and we have managed to actually managed to convince the Parliament to pass an 8-point policy for women empowerment and to actually improve gender issues within the Tibetan community.
Good, thank you. What's being done now in China to try to eliminate or moderate discrimination and inequality involving Tibetans? We in this country have so many problems of discrimination against minorities, access to apartment renting and things like that, and we try to deal with it through laws, administration, education, a variety of ways. What's going on in China with respect to this?
Do you want to? I'll give you the sort of formal academic part of that, which is that, which unfortunately may not mean very much. That's what we have to wait and see. But in September last year, Xi Jinping announced a new policy for what they called minorities, or what they call ethnic groups, which included as its slogan the phrase "strengthen cultural identification and oppose Greater Han chauvinism, Fan Da Han Juyi. So that we don't really know, I certainly don't know, and it's not clear from documents yet what those phrases mean. Strengthen cultural identification could mean a lot of things. It could mean strengthen identification of the minorities with China, with Chinese culture, could mean like that. This Greater Han chauvinism means oppose discrimination, oppose Han Chinese discrimination, condescension towards other people. So that's quite an important sounding slogan. But we don't know whether this is going to be implemented in practice. And there's some indications that it hasn't been so far. For example, in the Tibet Autonomous Region, where about half of the 6 million Tibetans live, basically no ordinary Tibetans have been allowed a passport or been allowed to travel abroad for the last 3 years. Of course, it's not written in on paper. It's not a ban that specifically identifies Tibetans. It could apply to Chinese in that area as well. But effectively, we're not yet seeing implementation of this policy. So we might have to wait and see if it actually comes into practice.
This isn't a new problem. China has had to deal with minorities, not just Tibetans. Xinjiang is in the news every day and has been for many years. It's not like the world is just trying to recognize the problem exists. Are you suggesting that the previous measures, constitution, legislation, administration, practice, it really hasn't been effective at all? What happens in terms of schooling? I don't know. Mota, did you go to school in China?
Yes, I did.
What was the situation? Where did you go?
I was in a Qinghai chapter, the northeast Qinghai, yeah, chapter. The school was a bilingual school at the time, but 1970s, 80s, pretty early. So that time was kind of, discrimination. Obviously, when I see Zenta's story, it's a totally, I can picture why Zenta was feeling the way she was feeling when she was in Beijing. When I was in a school, if I couldn't speak Chinese fluently, I was, you don't speak the language. So obviously at that time, and that was the discrimination. I couldn't recognize it was a discrimination, but I feel that I was discriminated. So anyway, so I really want to point out to something here. I really want to emphasize the movie, the film, and pull out some examples how that is going to really help Tibetans or, in Beijing and a discrimination. I want to really focus on a certain points in a movie, in a film. So I think in that way we can make our point across. So Zenta, for example, she was telling her story within her own Tibetan culture. That situation is, yes, Zenta is from a rural area, but I can tell that is that type of, the power and control kind of, like when you married out, you do not really, if you're against their wishes and you're not belong to that family. It's like Zenta, what she said. I really liked what Jocelyn's movie, the title, Nowhere to Call Home. It's Tibetans called Donbu. It's like you have no home, basically. So I think psychologically, I think it's a very, very sad thing for a Tibetan woman. And as a Tibetan woman, I'm pointing out to this. It's important for Tibetans to recognize inequality, the division, gender division. How they define gender division, they define actually the role, gender role. And in general, we have a lot of Tibetan old sayings. I actually, yesterday, I pulled out off the mind, I remembered so many Tibetan old sayings that are not really nice to Tibetan women. And for example, I'm going to say like one line of the, right now, just say, Tibetan we called pukamacho mukachas. So if anyone speak, Tibetan, you would know why. What that means, men haven't spoken yet. Women spoke. So I grew up with this kind of old sayings. I was like, why they're saying that? We are supposed to not to speak in front of people. You wait for men to really speak. So yes, this kind of, in a way it's a small, but in a way it's psychologically, it's not good for Tibetan girls to hear that. When Tibetan boys being told, it's like Tibetan saying like this. I can't think of now. Just let me think of this. Oh yeah. So pujina gachash. So if you are a man, you should be a great speaker, and if you are a woman, so these are Tibetan old sayings. I just want to point out. This is the root of the culture, how we were taught the inequality. And so when women were taught, like girls were told like this, how do we feel? So you are a boys being encouraged to speak up, express their, opinion. Women, if by birth, if you're a woman, you shouldn't. You really, how smart you are, but you shouldn't speak before men speak. So this kind of things, yes, with invaded Tibetan culture, I can say cross, but I can't also say this, every part of Tibet is they're using this kind of saying, but I can say part of an Amdo area. I'm pretty much sure maybe but I can say an Amdo area, pretty big area, regions do say this kind of old sayings. So when I said to a few of my friends, they were like, how do you remember all these Tibetan old sayings? Because I'm Tibetan woman, that's why. So anyway, so this is a part of psychologically, when you think about it, it's really not healthy for Tibetan girls to hear this when, Then also mothers always, they pray, they want to come back as a boy next rebirth. My mother always said that, I'm praying, next rebirth, I want to come back as a boy. I was like, why? So now I understand. You see that I saw like a few films and like Tibetan films, like documentaries, like it's called the Jambu's documentary. Ani Lachen, it's a 25 minutes documentary when a nun was seeking for like happiness and a nun, but she kept saying, I'm praying next rebirth, I want to come back as a boy. So this, you see, it is in the culture. Why women praying to come back as a boy, but the boys do not pray want to come back as a girl?
How different is this from the problem in China?
So, you mean the China?
Well, I mean, we have it in this law school.
Mm-hmm.
I spend a lot of time trying to bolster the confidence of women law students from China, who may be a lot smarter than some of the men in the class, but they're much more reluctant to speak up. And we have to help them and bring it out and call on them. And is this a Tibetan problem? Is it a universal problem, including an American problem? And what's distinctive about Tibet, if anything?
I only can talk about this is about it is in Tibetan culture. It is predominantly where I grew up. Really, I hear this a lot, but I cannot even say, as Professor Burnett said, that you cannot generalize. But as I said, I can generalize all Tibetan regions, all different regions, and Lhasa, Kham, Amdo, all of them, they are saying this, but I'm saying Amdo, particularly where I came from, I can say that, yes, this is common in that territory. And like discrimination, I just want to point out that Jocelyn's movie and the Zanta was talking about as a Tibetan woman in Beijing. Her lines were phenomenal, actually. If you know, you saw the and how Chinese treat Tibetan women, discriminated Tibetan people in China. I thought she was very brave to say that, and also I think in a way I also like the students' reaction, what Jocelyn showed, that why we always, one of the students said, why we always tell them what to do, why let the Tibetans, talk about what they want.
Who were these students, Jocelyn? Were they an elite international group?
So the high school students were at elite high schools. They're planning to study abroad. Some of the others were, these are mostly well-educated people. But I do think on that point, by showing the film in China, it gives me in mixed audiences of Tibetans and Han Chinese, it gives me the opportunity to raise issues that are really almost impossible to speak about in any ordinary situation. And I'd like to mention just one of the comments that was related to what you said by a Tibetan, a young man who watched the film. And it was at an anthropology conference in a room about this size, probably about 200 anthropologists from the area around Shanghai. And one of the professors stood up and said, yes, but what is your evaluation of what has happened since 1951? And I gave a rather irreverent response, I suppose, making an analogy to what happened in Manchuria after the Japanese came in and brought infrastructure and expected to be had rotten tomatoes thrown at me, but I wasn't. Nobody actually attacked me for making that. So anyway, I survived that. And then the Tibetan young man said, we want to develop ourselves. We do not want to be developed by you. And that has been something that I've been able to tell in many other classrooms. And I think some people start to get it when you talk about it in those terms. China did not appreciate that the Japanese brought in infrastructure and forced their other ways upon these people, and a lot of Tibetans also do not appreciate the.
Well, how about within China itself? I was struck when we lived in Hong Kong, 1963-4, the venom that Cantonese people sometimes showed against people from Shanghai, if not further north, and vice versa. There was so much regional discrimination, linguistic, cultural, many ways, different food. How different? Is this just another more extreme example?
Yeah, so I get this question a lot, or the comment a lot from Han Chinese audiences. Well, she's just another migrant worker. And what I'm hoping to do with the film in the future is to develop a curriculum. I've got one of the teachers at a high school is interested in developing a curriculum. He teaches global citizenship and critical thinking. It's a very forward-thinking high school. Yes, it exists, one teacher. But one teacher is better than none. But what I have found is what's lacking in China, I think more than anything, is an intellectual framework on which to think about this. I've had students have an emotional reaction saying, yes, something is wrong in this film. They don't know how to identify. You've got a major group, majority group in power, and an ethnic minority group who is treated, yes, some of the treatment is similar to other Han Chinese minority, Han Chinese from other areas outside of Beijing. But I think there's a very important difference when your whole group is treated this way and you do not identify as being Chinese. So I'm hoping I've started these conversations with audiences in China, but I find that the 1 hour conversation after the film is not quite long enough. I'm hoping to do at least weekend workshops or something longer and develop curriculum. So I do think there is obviously an important difference between the discrimination faced by Han majority migrants and Tibetan migrants, but perhaps other people would like to speak about
Have
this.
some reaction.
Yeah, I'd like to add quickly to what she said about the kind of mindset the people from her province have, I like to say that it's quite similar in the other two provinces. The fact that when it came to gender issues in our community in exile, we had such a hard time how to actually start educating our people, because their mindset is so strong about our culture and how it should be that we had to do a lot of research. The Tibetan government were not supportive. The men just felt that the Tibetan Women's Associations were going crazy. They felt it was not right. And in fact, I'd like to quickly mention that Alex over here is the executive director for Shelley and Donald Rubin Foundation, who is the sponsor for Tibetan Women's Association's first ever advanced leadership training. And I was a participant for the first and the second. So it's also a great privilege that he is here, you know. We have worked so hard. The Tibetan people, I think it has a lot to do with culture. I think it's not just with the Tibetans, but also within the Chinese women too. Because when we work, one of our most important issues, things, our priority is working for the Tibetan women inside Tibet, and that we figured out that it's, if you fight only for the Tibetan women, it doesn't work. So we have to work in context with the Chinese women and what the laws and the rules are for that. And we figured pretty much it's the same for them too.
We have a knowledgeable and diverse audience. I think it's time to give you an opportunity to make some comments or ask questions, whatever. And this is a theme that this law school will be pursuing under the awning of the Bernstein Institute and the U.S. Asia Law Institute. We are going to be trying to learn more about how to cope with questions of discrimination that affect every society. Anyone burning to say something useful? Ask any question. Yes, please.
Well, I got the impression from the film that women in China are better off than women in Tibet. I mean, it left me with that impression, and I wondered whether that's, I don't like to generalize, but is that a fair impression, a reality of the situation, or?
I guess that's my question, my question to me. Okay. I can't just say, you know, Chinese women's situations are better than Tibetan women's situation, and Tibetan women's situations are better than Chinese women's situation, because really this kind of a Zenta, when we watch Zenta's story, it's also it's a particular that it's really Zenta's story. And really striking things what we see there. Not in Tibet, not all Tibetan, you know, women are experiencing something like that. However, societal level, and when they really do not give the voice to Tibetan women, actually, it's a major decisions made by a Tibetan men usually. And sometimes, yes, it is changing. I've gone back to Tibet a few times, and I've seen the changing from the, you know, my upbringing to up to this level. It's 1990s I left Tibet, then I went back to Tibet in 2000, you know, after 2009 actually. And I see the major change. However, the perception, I think, and Tibetan society have to really value Tibetan women's voice. And that's what I try to make a point here. And the things, yes, Professor Rabbi Barnett actually mentioned that domestic violence situations, some of them are really, really striking. As professionally, I am a domestic violence counselor, but I see that because I know things happening, but not those kind of things not happening to only Tibetans, but to Chinese too. Professionally, I do work in Chinese population as well. However, but I can't say, okay, generalize which one's better than which one's worse. Yeah.
I just want to ask you, if you talk in terms of Chinese girls and Tibetan girls in terms of just focus on education, are the opportunities equal in both countries?
Well, this is also urban and rural. We have to divide. So if right now I see in Tibet, in the past my years, okay, that time, yes, in Tibetan society was not equal. They always choose the Tibetan boys go to school and girls stay home to take care of the children and support them, which happened in my family too. However, now it's really changing. I see all kids go to school. Unless, it's in a village, the family decided not to. But if a family decides and they still choose a boy to go to school over a girl, that's for sure, most likely.
I think it's worth noting that there is, it's great to have a representative from the Tibetan Women's Association here. There is a very strong movement, certainly in India and outside of Tibet, among the Tibetan communities, to address this issue. It's something that's not been able to be talked about. There is a huge political situation in which in the West you can't talk about anything negative about Tibet, and in China you can't say anything positive about Tibet. So you're stuck, because everybody wants to talk about independence, but when you ask people, what do you need justice, you need equality, you need jobs, you need education. You don't, so there's so much that can't be talked about right now because of this really awful political situation, and yet there's a lot going on, I think, to rectify the situation, both inside and outside of Tibet. So
one of the most striking things I remember hearing at one of Robbie Barnett's Columbia Tibet seminars was a Chinese human rights activist said, "We can't hope for real improvement in Tibet until there's real improvement all over China in human rights." And it makes some of these comparisons a little artificial, but I see the discussion has stirred some of my NYU colleagues. So I want to call on Ira Belkin and then Yu-Jie Chun, and then we'll keep going. Ira?
So, Mr. Johnson, first of all, thanks again for bringing the film back to NYU and showing it here. I want to ask a question about your, I think a lot of people have been surprised at how you've been able to show the film in China. And I wonder if, I know you've thought about this, do you feel like you're sort of flying under the radar, or do you feel like this needs some significant change, or something maybe we're not understanding about China's willingness to air documentaries or have discussions about sensitive subjects? On a list of sensitive subjects, Tibet is always at the top.
Are we going to have to bail you out of detention one of these days?
Will you please?
If they lock you up, take notes.
I will do that, but if Santa has a problem, then you're definitely, you're not letting you off the hook.
You have my card.
Good. The hotline, yes. I really can't answer the question, but let me give you one example. The day I was invited to screen my film at an NGO on International Women's Day, March 8th. 2 days before that, I believe it was 2 days, the famous 5 young women were brought into detention, and I told the organizers, I said, I will not, it was one of the first times that Zanta was going to actually appear for a Q&A. It was sold out, there was a long waiting list. It's very difficult to see my film in China. You can't get a ticket these days. So I was very nervous. I said, look, I'm pulling the plug if there's any risk to her. And he said, don't worry, the authorities watch us very carefully. We have had this on the website for several days. It's still there. And I said, okay, but if they're going to close it down. He said, no, they would close it down first. By noon, it was supposed to be a 4 o'clock screening. By noon on Sunday, they will let us know. So don't worry. And it went on, and everything was fine. And then the next public screening that she was supposed to show up at was last week or the week before. 3 hours before it was to go on, I got a call from the organizer saying, "The police are here, they want an advance copy of your film." And I said, "Well, is that optional?" And they said, "No." So I called it around and I said, "Look, if there's any risk to her, again, I'm pulling the plug. Again, full house, 30 people on the waiting list, whatever." I said, "I'm pulling the plug if there's a risk." And I called around again to my, the NGOs who know where the line is or whatever. And they said, "Give the police what they want. Don't argue. Ask them if it's okay for her to come." And of course I was concerned, are they going to bootleg it? And they said, "Don't worry, you make a low quality version." So I gave them, I said, "I can't make it before the screening," but the organizers negotiated a deal and I got it to them by the weekend. So there was one teacher in Guangzhou who was told not to show the film she teaches a gender class, and after the 5 women were arrested, she was told, they started watching her. So that did not happen, but other screenings have been going on. I don't know the reason why.
Robbie?
So I want to put in some distinctions here. It's not true that Tibet is sensitive if we're technical about that. It's just not true. It's a shorthand for Tibet politics, or political disputes about Tibet are extremely sensitive. And there's another issue which is somewhat sensitive, which is, as you all know, what the Chinese call Minzu Tuanjie, disrupting the unity of nationalities. That's pretty sensitive too. This film is not a film, of course. That's what's interesting about this film, about Tibet politics. It's about a Tibetan woman and about her treatment in Beijing and in her family. So it isn't on the surface sensitive in the way that we're talking about. It could be because it suggests criticism of Chinese behavior, the way they treat migrants in the sea. That's a pretty commonly discussed topic. The advantage of the film is it's requiring people to talk about it. It's becoming an educational topic. It's not necessarily a political threat at all, certainly not on the Tibet side, because it's showing China says it went into Tibet to liberate people from backward conditions, and that's what the film appears to be showing. If you want to be a Chinese politician looking at it as an opportunity to be proud about China going into Tibet. It is interesting that it challenges Chinese claim about how they treat Tibetans, but that's not so radical. But what's radical is the arrest of these 5 feminists, because that doesn't fit anything I've just described. They weren't very political. They weren't doing major protests. They were talking about women's issues, which haven't been seen as threats to the state before. So things are changing in China all the time. They can go in any direction. But it's not that this film is sensitive just because it's about Tibet. But
it does show evidence that Zanta is certainly stirring up a crowd.
Yeah, that's the interesting part.
And have they moved against her? There were menacing-looking police in the film, but did they ever lock her up? Take her away?
God forbid. How dare you? So she has had visits in her hometown from local officials, and that was, I think, a result of a New York Times article, which was translated into Chinese, unbeknownst to me. That wasn't part of the deal when I gave the interview. And it was fine when the article came out last summer in English, nothing happened. But when it was translated into Chinese, and even though the Chinese version is blocked in China, it was immediately all over the internet, and there were too many translations to sort of take it down. So even though there was one thing that was incorrect in the article, that was...
You know, in the United States, being banned in Boston was good for a book sales. Is there any way to exploit that for your film or for the cause more generally? Have you been reviewed in the social media, in the Chinese press?
So I've had many requests for interviews, but because Zanta is concerned about basically the future of her son's education, and because he's had a very anti-Tibetan teacher, things are very dicey. So we are, I've not responded to the request.
So you're linking your freedom to talk to her fate also. It isn't that you could deal with this separately.
No, I think the reaction, until she is comfortable, I don't want to exploit everything I could exploit in China. And there is a lot to exploit. One other point related to some of the earlier comments is that one very optimistic Chinese producer loved my film and said, I'm bringing it to CCTV, the state broadcaster. It's so great, they got to play this. And I was like, yeah, really? Anyway, I said, go, try, go ahead. And he brought it in, and the CCTV guys loved it.
What?
They said, if only I'd been Han Chinese, it would have been perfect. But I'm American, so.
Can I follow up on that? I wonder. I think it's great that this is showing in China. Sorry, that it's exposing all of these issues and bringing these issues to a wide audience. But I just want to expand on something that Robbie just briefly mentioned. This is a question to Jocelyn. Is there a possibility, and have you heard in any comments, that this is reinforcing negative stereotypes of Tibet in China?
So I would like to be very clear about this, that I think the comparison of are women treated worse here or there, blah, 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 that doesn't matter. If you're treated badly in one place, does it matter if people elsewhere are treated badly as well? I think the point is that we have no research, very little information about the situation of women, and very few women have spoken out about it. I think the problem is the lack of information and the lack of interest, which all goes back to suggest, yes, there is a gender bias in research, basically. Half the population is female. What do we know about them? Why? I would also like to say that, what is representative? I think that's a really important point because Tibet is such a vast area with so many different customs, etc. I would like to argue that the majority of films that you have seen about Tibetan monasteries are not as representative as my film, which is about a rural person. A majority of Tibetans live in rural areas. At least, I don't know what the most recent statistics are about literacy, but probably half. What do you know? Any? Not even half. Less than half are literate? Yeah.
Have Tibetans protested about your film? It has a certain number of what the Chinese would call internal contradictions. On the one hand, you can't have anybody who looks more vicious than the father-in-law. On the other hand, Zanta says, we Tibetans treat everybody in a humane manner. We're not like the Chinese, etc. Well, he's not much of an example of a humane person. Have you had any complaints?
Yeah, so on this last point, I think that, is there any religion, if you go to the Catholic religion and say, well, pedophile problem, that shouldn't have existed either. I don't think any, I think these sort of contradictions happen for every group, and it's just that they have not been exposed as much in the Buddhist tradition, I believe. But in terms of, I was really quite worried about how Tibetan men would respond to my film. And are there any Tibetan men in here today? No? I must admit that was the one group that I thought I would have the biggest problem with, and I've been really quite delighted, especially about the response from young Tibetan men. The very first public screening in China, the very first question was by a young Tibetan student. He shot his hand up in the back of the room, and having been in China a long time, but not being quite used to speaking in front of audiences, I didn't realize my job was to choose the important man in the first chair, the first seat first. So I was so excited, the first screening, and he's there. So I point to him, and he just says, "Thank you so much for making this film."
Great. You, Jet Chun?
So I have one comment and one question. My comment on the film to Jocelyn is this is deeply touching, and it also intellectually unravels layers of domination and discrimination very well. There's a layer of domination and discrimination of gender, based on gender, in the Tibetan community as well as the Han society. There's a layer of ethnic discrimination in China, and there's also a layer of discrimination based on your social class. Like Zanta goes to Beijing as a migrant worker, and she seems to really suffer from the worst of all worlds. And
I think this is not an easy story to tell, and I commend you for telling it so well. And I agree with you that we need to have a better intellectual framework to think about all these questions regarding domination and discrimination. And my question to the legal scholars in this audience, since we're a law school, I wonder what else we can do in addition to, say, enacting legislations that prohibit discrimination. I feel in our discussion, it seems the more important thing is to have education, to raise public awareness, to be able to intellectually better think about these questions. And there seems to be very insignificant role of legal institutions, and I just wonder what kind of things that as legal community can contribute to this.
Maybe we can ask not only Jocelyn, but any of our other speakers to put in some final word. Then we're going to move across the hall for informal reception. So this won't end your opportunity to exchange ideas.
Oh, there's one more question. Yeah, no, I would just like to say that in the classroom discussions, I mean, what I really would like to do is bring in, for example, films of ethnic minorities from other countries to just talk about these issues. And I think that's really very important. But I will let you speak about the...
Lotte?
Sangmo.
Yeah. Well, as a Tibetan, I think Tibetans live in a, it's a territory. It's really like Qinghai province or, Gannan province. It's like 3 regions. But 3 regions, if really Chinese government want to give some kind of status, can Chinese government give the 3 regions to utilize the Tibetan language? And I think the discrimination also comes from that. Like, Tibetans don't speak Chinese. They really automatically, you don't belong to that society. So in America, I see that by law, you have to provide an interpreter or something. Otherwise, it's you are discriminating. So that's it was on my mind. And can they do something about that? Utilize the Tibetan language in a Tibetan, particularly Tibetan territory. Tibetans have to study and Chinese have to speak Chinese, but can they do bilingual? So I think that's really important. And yes, Tibetans go to school, they do study bilingual Chinese in Tibetan, but there are a lot of rural areas and they don't speak Chinese. They come to a city, they buy something, they're just totally, they can't do anything. So I think that really concerns me as a Tibetan, and I saw that when I was in Tibet. And then the other one is like a really open dialogue. Like Jocelyn's film is great. As you said, every angle really talks about a lot of issues. I think if we can openly dialogue about it, I think it's really good. Both the Chinese and the Tibetans and communicate. Otherwise, maybe Chinese are projecting things to Tibetans and projecting things to Chinese people. So who knows? We all know. So,
We have time for 2 comments. I see 3 from the floor. If you could make it quick. Sharon, you'll be the next one, please.
I just have a question for Jocelyn, which is, have you been able to or figured out a way of actually screening the film in parts of Tibet?
I'm working on it. Thank you.
Sharon?
Yeah, thank you, Jocelyn. Just for you and Xander, it's just beautiful.
Thank
really
you.
Beautiful. I just want to make a quick comment in the space between this whole conversation, between Robbie's, as usual, wise caution not to generalize, and I think the very rich layers of the film, which you did such a beautiful job of unpackaging, the richness of it. I want to jump into that space and to add, I think there's another layer. And the other layer is, which is a subtext through the whole thing, it's a very real, and speaking as a Cantonese, Jerry, spirit world is not superstition. but of just belief in things like beyond this life and from before this life. And I remember my Han Chinese Beijing colleagues in law was shocked that I, a lawyer, Western trained, would do things like burn paper before I entered my door from the cemetery, you know. And I said, and they said, Professor Han, you're a Western trained lawyer. I said, no, I'm a Cantonese Western trained lawyer. You gotta cover all your bases here. So I think it's very rich in there. And I think it's really striking when you try to solve the solution through what I think is contract. I mean, this agreement-written contract in this spirit world was, I just went, yikes, you know. But it kind of worked. You know, so I think there's that richness of that belief. And also, it's not just about superstition. It's about what we owe each other. And it's not just this lifetime, how those connections are beyond. I think that's unfathomable to certain people, and not just Han Chinese, like Northern Han, Chinese in particular. But I think that understanding that the world has that fabric that's unseen. So I think that was very important and rich. The intellectual framework, which I don't want to take away Jerry our thunder tomorrow morning, but I think a big piece of that intellectual framework, and we don't have an answer either, it's human rights and China's human rights obligations, because Tibetan women's issues were raised at CERD, at the Convention on Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The Tibetan children were raised, these issues, at the Rights of the Child. They were raised at the CEDAW review. So I think it's the same struggle on how we get China to actually live within its international obligations. I'm not going to go there now, but I think that's part of the intellectual framework. And the last thing I want to say is commonality. This is not generality, Robbie, it's commonality. And I think that one of the things that's very important to support the efforts of Jocelyn and Xanta after this film is to take it beyond the film, and that is the conversations. And the film created some kind of opening in space, and I do think in part it's there because it jives with the government's narrative about Tibetan backward culture. So it's very, I think, subversive to go into that space created by this negative narrative and create a conversation. And I don't know if people agree with me that work on the Tibet political question. I don't think that question can be solved without Han Chinese, all of us, understanding the complexities better. Not to say it's Han Chinese unity, but it's like, what are the commonalities? What are the differences? And I think that's the beginning of it. And the commonalities that I think cross the board within China, not to mention beyond China. Not just the gender-based discrimination, not just the public-private violence, but I think there's another beyond gender. Those street vendors, I bet a lot of Chinese, Han Chinese street vendors, if they saw this, not, you weren't shown in elite schools, but like a Chinese vendor saw that on the Youku video, they'd get it. The anger about that kind of indignity, the kind of abuse and disrespect from police and from the Changguan.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot there for finding commonality to address a very complex problem that doesn't flatten it. And it's very exciting that you're going to do a great film.
I'm glad, Sharon, that you've spoken up. Sharon Hom, for those who don't know her, has been the executive director of human rights in China, with which we at the law school have had long cooperation. And she's now going to join our faculty as part of the Bernstein Institute initiative. And she's given you a taste of what you'll experience tomorrow morning at 10:30 if you come to hear a continuation of this in perhaps a more legalistic context when Ira Belkin and Sharon and others will be holding forth. But let's move across the hall. We've exceeded our time here.
Could I just say one
last word from our creator?
Yes. Very to Sharon, eloquent comments. I am a short-term pessimist, long-term optimist. I think the biggest, most important thing everybody in this room could think about and do is make not only TOEFL a requirement, but a multicultural training before students matriculate to U.S. universities, every single student would go study it. Every single student would understand discrimination, racism, etc. At least they'd have the vocabulary, because I have met with students here who arrive, they don't know how to talk to people about these issues. They don't even know they exist. So I think I'm outlandish here, but I think there should be new requirements.
Thank you all very much.